Chapter 18. Once off the trail, Matt felt as if he had entered an unending maze of trees and bushes. He, Tony, and Hooter tripped over logs and fell over one another in their struggle to keep up with the Indians. Matt marveled at the ease with which his guides moved through the difficult terrain. They never seemed to take an awkward step. Each movement was light and graceful in comparison to his own clumsy gait. After what seemed like hours of forging through forests, the Indians stopped by a small grove of trees. "What are they stopping for?" Tony whispered. They sat watching as one of the Indians untied the bag of berries that hung from his waist. He put the bag under his foot and stepped on it. Then he took his finger and dipped it in the bag. When he took his finger out, it was bright red, and he brought the reddened finger up to his face. "Wow, war paint!" Hooter exclaimed on seeing the bright red slashes across the Indian's cheeks. Matt sat transfixed, watching the Indian boys decorate their faces when he was younger. Matt had used his finger paints, pretending to paint himself up like an Indian warrior. Now he could hardly believe that he was seeing the real thing. "Do you think it's really war paint?" Tony asked. "Shh, shh," one of the Indians suddenly whispered. He had begun to scout ahead, and I just turned around to signal them. Matt and the others stood watching as the Indian picked up a stick and held it like a gun. "The Hessians," Matt whispered to Hooter and Tony. Then the Indians signaled for them to follow. Matt and the boys carefully made their way behind him as soundlessly as they could. The Indians stopped at a large group of bushes. Standing in the cover of the shrubbery, one of them silently pointed to the right. Matt followed his gaze to see Katie and Q sitting around a campfire that was just above a creek. 3 Hessian grenadiers in blue and white uniforms were sitting beside them. Matt sighed with relief in seeing his sister. Then he looked over to the soldiers. "So those are the bloodthirsty giants," he thought. They did seem imposing in their fine uniforms and heavy black boots that went up past their knees. The men had strong, broad faces with thick mustaches. As one of the soldiers stood up to tend the fire, Matt could see that he was no taller than most men, and if anything, a bit on the short side. Then the soldier reached for his black fur hat that was on the ground. "So that's why they look like giants," Matt thought, on seeing the soldier put on the long cone-shaped hat. It stood almost 2 feet above his head. Matt looked over at the 3 muskets that stood leaning against a tree. Their bayonets were polished to a high gleam. While they weren't the bloodthirsty giants he was expecting, Matt could see that these Hessians were still a formidable foe. Their uniforms and weapons were those of the professional soldier, and unlike the ragged American rebels, Matt knew that these soldiers had been highly trained for professional warfare. The Indian boys seemed to sense this too and began to back away. "No, we can't leave," Matt pleaded. "I have to rescue my sister." But the Indians shook their heads and turned around, disappearing into the woods. Matt, Tony, and Hooter stood staring after them. "What did they put all that war paint on for if they aren't going to stay and fight?" Hooter whispered. "I guess it wasn't war paint," Matt muttered. "I hate to say it," Hooter whispered, "but I think have the right idea. We're no match for these guys. Maybe we could catch up if we hurry," he said, turning around in the direction of the Indians. "Tony, where's your sense of loyalty?" Matt exclaimed, grabbing his sleeve. "That's Katie and Q over there. They are fellow club members, part of our tribe, don't you see? The Indians risked their lives to get us here. Now it's up to us to save our people." "But we don't even have any weapons to save them with," Tony moaned. "Those soldiers have guns and swords. We have courage and sticks. Just pick up a big stick," Matt ordered. "A stick?" Tony whimpered. "Did he say a stick?" "Maybe we could convince them that we're friends," Hooter suggested. "Well, looks like Q was trying to do just that," Matt whispered, pointing to Q, who had just stood up. The boys watched in horror as one of the soldiers suddenly drew a sword and began to shout. Q stood shaking his head. "I don't know what you want," he cried, as another soldier reached over and began going through his pockets. The soldier said something in German and then pulled out a small object from Q's back pocket. "What is it?" Hooter whispered. "What did he get?" "I don't know," Matt replied. "It's too small to see. But whatever it is, it sure has them interested." The other 2 soldiers had gathered together to look down at the strange object in their comrade's hand. A look of confusion came over their faces as they tried to figure out just what the purpose of the object was. "Was is that?" one of the soldiers demanded, looking back at Q. It's a piece of bubble gum," Q blurted out. The soldier turned the gum over several times, then unwrapped it. He stood for a long time, squinting out at the tiny comic that was printed on the inside wrapper. As Matt looked on from the bushes, he noticed that this Hessian soldier was a young, burly man with broad shoulders and a thick neck. He had a bushy brown mustache and ruddy red cheeks. His eyes were a clear crystal blue. The officer reminded Matt of Tommy from Custom Car Wash, which was just down the street from Matt's house. Matt wondered what this officer would look like washing a car. He imagined him with a hose in his hand instead of a sword. He imagined that he would look just like Tommy except for the mustache. The officer suddenly looked up and smiled. It must have been a good comic, Hoda whispered as they watched the smiling soldier hold the gum up before Q. It's for chewing, Q tried to explain. He pointed to his mouth and began to chew. The officer nodded and brought the gum to his nose. He smiled again, inhaling the sweet watermelon scent. Watermelon was Q's favorite flavor. The officer broke off half of the gum and handed it to Q, motioning for him to put it in his mouth. What does he think it is? Poison? Hooter whispered. He doesn't even speak English. He probably feels like he can't trust anyone. Matt whispered back. They watched Q take the gum and put it in his mouth. All the soldiers had fixed their gaze on Q, who was chewing as fast as he could. Now comes the best part, Q said. His voice quivered with fear. He closed his eyes and blew a big pink bubble. The soldiers all stood gaping at the strange sight of the American boy with a pink bubble coming out of his mouth. They all jumped when the bubble broke with a loud bang. Q motioned for the soldier with the gum to try it himself. Just take a few chews, and then you can blow a bubble yourself, Q said, pointing to the gum in the soldier's hand. The curious Hessian couldn't resist the opportunity. He slowly brought the gum to his mouth and licked it with his tongue. Das ist gut, the soldier exclaimed. He chewed it several times and swallowed it. No, Q said, shaking his head. You aren't supposed to swallow it. It's just for chewing and blowing bubbles. The soldier frowned and pointed to Q's pocket. I haven't any more, Q told him. Honest, that was my last piece, he cried as the soldier began searching his other pockets. When he pulled out a wadded dollar bill, the soldier carefully unfolded it and stood staring at the face that was printed on the middle of the bill. A chill ran through Matt as he knew that was coming next. What was coming next? Rebel, the Hessian said sternly. I'm not a rebel, the boys could hear Q trying to explain. That's just the dollar bill for my allowance. Can't they see he's not old enough to be a soldier? Tony whispered. It doesn't matter, Matt told him. When I worked on my history report, it read that there were a lot of American boys used as spies and runners for the rebels. Do you think that Q is a spy? There's no telling what they'll do to him. We've got to come up with a plan. As they watched from the bushes, the boys could see that the soldiers had laid down their muskets and were busy inspecting George Washington's portrait on the dollar bill. If that dollar bill can hold their attention long enough, we'll be able to sneak in, take their guns, and ambush them, Matt said, trying to sound as confident as he could. We will? Tony squeaked. Are you sure you don't want to give this some more thought? Hooter whispered. We don't have time for any more thought, Matt said, shaking his head. This may be our only chance. But we don't even know how to shoot those muskets, Tony objected. That's true, Matt said, but the Hessians don't know that. All we have to do is point them in their direction and they'll probably surrender to us. Probably, Tony asked, shaking his head. Don't worry, Tony, Hooter said, putting his arm around his little friend. Matt knows what he is doing, don't you, Chief? Sure, Matt gulped. He tried to look as courageous as he could for the sake of Tony and Hooter, but his stomach hurt and he felt like crying. Matt thought of all the brave men he had met last night and hoped he could show as much courage now. He took a step forward. Hooter followed, with Tony nervously clinging to his arm. Within seconds, they reached the campfire. The soldiers were huddled together, inspecting the bill as their muskets stood propped against a tree. Matt could hear Hooter's heavy breathing behind him, and he knew that one wrong move could well be their last. When they reached the tree, Matt took a deep breath and reached for a musket. Tony and Hooter did the same. At the sound of their footsteps, the Hessians swung around and drew their swords. Katie screamed, Q yelled, and Matt did the one thing that he had so hoped he wouldn't. He closed his eyes and didn't move.